Good evening. I'm a glass half full kind of person, which I guess is why I was called to pick the case for optimism. Can you hear me up the back? Yeah, right. So when the recent turmoil in the markets came up the other day, I thought, oh, goody, it means that we'll have a bit of a crowd. I didn't worry so much about the superannuation. I left that for another day. The challenge for most people in making sense of the financial crisis isn't the lack of expert opinion. There's a range of competing views with wildly divergent opinions. What you need to know actually is who to make sense, who to believe. That's the challenge that we have with the financial crisis. And in these kind of situations, there's a simple rule that I recommend that you follow. When people can hold wildly different views for sustained periods of time without fear of being corrected, what that implies is no one really knows. If someone knew, there would be someone correcting it. The correct view would rise up. So the remarkable thing about finance is that much of what people assume, and the reason why this is relevant, is that much of what people assume is known in finance isn't really known. Take, for example, the statement from Eugene Farmer. Some of you will have known of him. He's the originator of the efficient market hypothesis. And in an interview last year with John Cassidy of The New Yorker, he made this, what I thought was a remarkable statement. He says, "We don't know what causes recession. We've never known. Debates go on to this day about what caused the Great Depression. Economics is not very good at explaining swings in economic activities." So now, the thing is, he's, as I said, the originator of the efficient market hypothesis, and surprising as this may seem to people who believe it's been thoroughly discredited, which I'm not one of those people, but if you possibly might be, he's at serious risk of winning the Nobel Prize. And the reason I mention that is that if someone like Eugene Farmer says that we don't know what causes economic recession, it means that we really don't have an effective consensus on this perspective, on the crisis. One consequence of this is that if we don't know what causes a recession or how to avert it, then there is no obvious solution, which is why I have a great deal of sympathy for Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott and all the other politicians. It's their job to project an image of certainty and with their solutions, but really, no one really knows. But the other less well-appreciated consequence, implication of no one really knowing, is that the markets really don't know as well. If the markets knew, then we could look to the markets as a predictor, which is why when 90 out of 100 economists would have said when the US debt was downgraded, the cost of the US of borrowing would have gone up. In fact, it fell. When 70 out of 100 economists would expect that the recent turmoil in Europe, in the European financial market and the problems of the Greek debt would cause gold to be a safe haven, be more attractive as a safe haven, and the price would fall. In fact, gold plunged. So the upside of all this is that the severe downturn in the market doesn't necessarily portend, as many of you might be expecting, a severe recession, which is a point made by Paul Samuelson some time back. He's arguably the most influential modern economist, and he says, commentators quote economic studies alleging that market downturns predicted 4 out of the 5 recessions. His point is, this is actually a severe understatement. Wall Street indices predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions. So if we don't know what caused an economic recession, what do we know about economics? What we do know, and this is one of my main point over here, what I want to lead you to believe, is something that the communists came to appreciate and act on in 1978. Markets work. Despite the recent ructions in the market, it's not capitalism that is dead, but Marxism. Capitalism is very much alive. The most effective practitioners of capitalism on the planet are the communists in China. Now, this is actually quite interesting. It's interesting. It is right that this poses a particular challenge to our worldview. But before I get to that, I want to point to something else. This is a graph of a representation of the 7 most populous countries in Asia. And this is Australia. How many people are there in Indonesia, do you think? People often talk about Americans being ignorant, but a question I want to put to you is, what's the population of Indonesia, one of our nearest neighbors?
140 million.
That's my wife. I told her that yesterday. The 7 largest countries in Asia is 3.18 billion people. In Indonesia, it's 235 million. Australia, 22 million. We ought to be caring about what happens. We ought to be caring about what happens here to us. But a visitor from Mars would, if looking at taking the health of the planet into account, the economic crisis, an economist from Mars, if she came down, she would be worried about what's going on over here. It's not the common worldview, though. It's not the way most people see this, particularly in the Western world. This is a statement from David Brooks of the New York Times, fairly recent. It came up yesterday in the New York Times, The Lost Decade. He says, if you want a big swing of despair, listen to the people who know something about the global economy. Well, let me give you some facts about the global economy. People often say that if the US catches a cold, or if the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Well, the US has got a big dose of flu. But the rest of the world hasn't caught pneumonia. This is the growth in real GDP per person since 2007. Why 2007? Because that's when the global financial crisis occurred. When you look at these figures, go back to your figures. This is the good news story that we have. GDP in China has increased by about 35%. In India, it's increased. There are more poor people in India than in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. There are more starving people in India. So what happens in India matters a great deal to the world. What happens in Indonesia with 235 million matters a lot to us. And the news is unequivocally good since the crisis. The other interesting thing is look at Germany. Germany is one of those nanny economies, over-regulated. It's the only one of the G8 economies that's actually has done well, has recorded some serious growth since the crisis. Let me focus on Indonesia. And this is my point, to go back, that markets work. How did this happen? It's because these countries open themselves to market. It's not because they open themselves to more government control. But I'll come back to that point. There's a subtlety there. It says, Indonesia is one of the few nations to have avoided recession despite its heavily export-driven economy. Its consumer market is booming, with more than 60 million low-income workers projected to enter its rapidly expanding middle class in the coming decade. Most people still think of the tsunami when they think of Indonesia. The good news, there's 60 million low-income workers entering the middle class, several times the size of Australia's population. And what's more, the poverty reduction in rural areas is much bigger than in the urban areas. I want to come back to the challenge this particular poses. The dominant ideology in Australia, in the West, is the one that's peddled by the Institute of Public Affairs, a free people, a free society. They say core focus of the Institute of Public Affairs is examining paternalist government regulation. Having the government assume the role of risk managers is damaging to the principle of individual responsibility. The unfortunate thing for the Institute of Public Affairs is that the facts don't align nicely with its particular worldview. Looking at them, and they had a recent survey saying most Australians believe that Australia is becoming a nanny state. Have a look at the ranking of the 2011 Index of Economic Freedom. The Heritage Foundation, by the way, is very closely aligned with the Institute of Public Affairs, so this isn't some biased left-wing kind of thing. It's quite the opposite, in fact. But have a look at who's above. This won't surprise many of you to see that who's above Australia? It's Singapore, the other arch-capitalists. Is Singapore a nanny state? You be the judge. I'm often accused of interfering in the private lives of citizens. Yes, if I had I not done that, we wouldn't be here today. And I say without the slightest remorse, we decide what is right. Never mind what the people think. Lee Kuan Yew, the man, rightly, a great man, I think. He's done a lot is credited with bringing Singapore from a country that had a lower standard of living of Sri Lanka than Singapore back in the 60s to where it is now. He didn't do it by not being a nanny. He didn't do it by just letting free market forces rule. Linda Lim is a foremost economist. She's a Singaporean. And she's been invited back to speak in Singapore, but she now is in the University of Michigan. And this is what she says. She says, state policies and actions have influenced resource allocation by changing relative prices. State interventions have given Singapore a comparative advantage in export manufacturing, which it would not have had if free market forces alone prevailed. My point here is that we have a challenge. Markets work, but we need to re-examine the role of governments in markets. And as I think the success of the Asian economies, China, and even Germany show. So I'll summarize. What we don't know is what causes economic downturns and how to fix them. What we do know is that markets work. Markets need facilitating. And why I'm optimistic is because Australia is still the lucky country. I mean, there's two reasons for optimism. It's the fact that the vast majority of the world's population is coming out of desperate poverty into the middle class, doesn't fill you with good cheer. Something a little bit more self-interested might. It's the fact that the demand from Asia for our resources and agricultural farm produce is likely to continue for the next few decades. You are sitting in the hotspot in the world, one of the best places in the world to be, at UWA Business School. Thank you very much.